Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraad, bringing you Capitalism Hits Home, a program about the mutual shaping of personal life in the United States and personal feelings and connections, personal well-being with political and economic forces that shape our lives. Today, I want to talk about the election. The results are very dramatic, very surprising. They may not be accurately reported, and they are certainly surprising, and so I'd like to address them. Presuming Trump didn't steal this election, which, he might have, it's a presumption, why did he win? What happened? That's a good question, I think. And I think the results have a lot more to do with psychology than they do with questions of political economy. Americans are really frightened. Particularly American men are frightened. Their guns and their workouts don't protect them. The American dream is largely dead. And with the American dream, as long as you were white and male, you could make a decent living, and you could support a dependent wife who was a full-time servant. She did your housework, she did your childcare, she emotionally labored to understand you, she connected you with relatives and couple friends, and she gave you a sense of safety that somebody was serving you, a kind of safety that allowed men to deny they needed anybody because somebody else was right there taking care of their needs and allowing them to deny those needs. So what happened here? Well, also I must say, I have to include this, if you were the wife of a white male, you got a certain social status as Mrs. somebody, and you also got a level of economic security for life. We have to remember that as late as 1990, America was a 90% white country. And so this was a dominant gift of white maleness to the population. Now, why aren't men and women interested in fighting for the life they used to have, for the decent home, and men for the full-time servant that they used to have at home? Why aren't they interested in fighting capitalism, which brought them those highly dubious poison gifts? Well, Americans have become very passive, politically very passive, a passivity that was bred by many things. One is the removal of their secure jobs and their unionized jobs. They used to have in the 1950s and 60s, there was 33%, fully a third of American workers were in unions. And those unions were very important because one was known at one's corporation, one's manufacturing unit, and one had a certain status as such. But what happened was, in the mid-70s, with fast jet travel and computers and faxes and other such machines, capitalists were able to export, i.e., outsource well-paid worker jobs to countries like China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, countries with salaries that were less than a tenth of what they paid American workers. And they didn't have unions. They didn't have ecological protections to worry about or worker benefits. So this was a boondoggle for capitalists who then brought their billions home and bought our elections. America is one of the few developed nations that allows private money in elections, but we sure did. And so billions were spent, and American workers felt like they didn't have much power here. And you know why? They didn't. That's why France and Germany don't allow any private money in elections. They don't allow any radio and TV ads. They give their potential officers, public servants or dominators or whatever, 2 months to run. They're allowed to poster, to advertise, but they're not allowed to have any other form of advertising. And then they all get up on government-paid TV and have a chance to talk for about 15 minutes about what they stand for. So people can see their political platforms. They also have a lot of parties to choose from, because in France or Germany or most of Europe, they have what's called proportional representation. So they have a lot of parties, and if you get 10% of the votes, you get 10% of the seats in the government. And so that voting for third parties makes sense. I watched the candidates once when I was in France. I watched them on television. There were about 8 of them. And with huge choice. It's not a choice of 2 capitalists, but there were capitalists, there were communists, there were socialists, there were anarchists, there were monarchists. Huge choice of system, of economic system, rather than just personality and some platform choices. At any rate, they have a lot more democracy. We have the best democracy money can buy, and those who aren't rich, which is about 97% of the population, felt disempowered. And guess why? They were disempowered. They were disempowered because they didn't have a group to unify that would balance the billions that billionaires spent to get what they wanted in the elections. Also, Americans didn't really know, because of that and our very compliant press, that there are alternatives to capitalism. They don't see that there's socialism, there's communism, there's anarchism, there's monarchism. They think, okay, that's what government is. Capitalism. 2 capitalist parties who mainly favor the people who put them in. Why? Why don't Americans have that consciousness? Well, there's a bunch of reasons. One is that they just are very isolated from one another. When their jobs were exported and their community connections were gone, they were isolated. Humans are social animals. We need each other. And to protest and organize, we really need each other. The worst punishment is solitary confinement, where you can't reach out to other people. In many American towns and cities were dominated by some huge factories. In those factories, one worked for one's whole working life, and often the family worked there too. So you had a certain recognition as a machinist who was a senior machinist, or as anything else. And that recognition left. You don't get much recognition when you work for Amazon, call centers, fast food, or Walmart, America's biggest employers now. And the unions were not there. The unions created social contacts. They had buying clubs. They had bowling leagues. They had meetings of organizers and social events. And so people were in contact with a whole other group of workers, and they and their wives would get together. There was a sense of a community, which was gone with manufacturing. I must say also that the strong unions in other countries stopped outsourcing. France and Germany and all over Scandinavia, they don't allow outsourcing. because the union fought it and won. So that didn't happen in the United States. Instead, people turned inward. They sat at home in their own little apartment or house, watching their own television set, alienated from one another, alone, and often getting fat on junk food in front of the TV. There was another thing that happened here that made Americans feel that there is no alternative to capitalism. In fact, it was summarized in a little acronym, TINA, there is no alternative. Why not? Why do workers in other countries see there are alternatives? Well, partly it's anti-communism in the United States. In the 1950s, the McCarthy period of anti-communism began, where anyone who was a communist, a socialist, or a leftist was highly suspect. And I should mention that 1 out of 4 families had an active communist before that, and the Communist Party was very popular. They had the slogan, "Communism is the new Americanism." It was very much accepted. But the employees were getting scared, and they wanted that to be changed. Because, really, employers are 3% of our population, employees 97%, and they really do need to keep people apart because a real unity is a threat. Why didn't it happen in Europe? Why do they have more active people? Why do the French spill out and protest when they don't get what they wanted or when they're horrified, as they were by the rape that I talked about recently, or they are by their leader Macron not according leadership to the left unified parties that won, but giving the prime ministership to a right-winger. The anti-communist movement in the United States really worked to repress the whole idea of class so that the 97% wouldn't get the idea that to unify, they could easily win over the 3% that are employers, because they're 97% of the population, the employees. Class awareness was repressed across the board in the United States. Why wasn't it? I asked, and it deserves an answer. Why wasn't it repressed in France and Germany and all over Europe? Well, there was a big difference. In Europe, it was the Communist Party that organized the resistance, and everyone knew that and was grateful to them. The United States created a Marshall Plan of giving Europe large amounts of money to rebuild on condition that they repressed the communists. They couldn't do it as overtly or completely as America did because the population wouldn't go along with it. The communists were heroes there. They ran the resistance. But what they could do, and they did do, is they mandated that university professors could not be Marxists or communists, or socialists or leftists. And so what did the university professors do there? Well, they joined unions and became powerful in the unions and helped those unions become very strong and very radical in both France and Germany. That's very impressive and very important. The AFL-CIO in the United States went along with the McCarthyites and the anti-communists. And Philip Murray, who was then the head of the AFL-CIO, created a movement to kick all the communists and what they considered their fellow travelers, the socialists, and also fellow travelers, the leftists, out of the unions. And they did so. They hounded them out of the unions. Well, those were the spark of the union movement. The people who felt that workers create all value and they should get all of the profit, They were really the engine of union militancy. So, after kicking out all the spark of the unions went from 33 and a third of American workers to 11.2%, about 11% of the workers. Unions were cut by 2/3 and their militant sectors were eliminated and they dwindled. They're only recently coming back. So that's another reason. The anti-communism of the American government really hurt workers and increased their passivity. Another force that helped Americans become so passive that they're in a bad way and have maybe elected, many of them in any case, voted for a fascist, authoritarian fascist, is what the French philosopher called ideological state apparatuses. His theory, his name is Louis Althusser, Althusser, and his theory was that there are ideological state apparatuses, which are the family, religion, and authoritarian education, or authoritarian religion and authoritarian education, that teach people to police themselves and be subordinate from the inside. So you don't need the cops and you don't need soldiers because people already cower. They already feel they shouldn't speak up, that they have no authority. They should just obey. And in the United States, those are present. Authoritarian education, authoritarian families, and authoritarian religions dominated America. They still are a strong force, but they're not as dominant now. Increasingly, particularly women are less religious than they used to be. The Pew Charitable Trusts put that out, and fewer people are organized in authoritarian religions. What these religions did and what the family did, they enforced the family. Authoritarian religions enforced the family as the social safety net and social support system for humanity. They certainly don't want taxes to be levied so that the government could be required to help support families. Organizations like Focus on the Family, which is a dominant evangelical Christian organization, have huge followings where they teach people that children must be disciplined. Their most famous author is a man named James Dobson, whose books are bestsellers and required reading for young parents who are devout Christians in the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the second biggest religious group in the United States. And their books like Dare to Discipline and The Disobedient Child, how you have to crush a child's spirit so they obey, or else they will be taken over by Satan because their self-assertion is satanic. That has to be done. Children's oppositional behavior has to be crushed as an outgrowth of Satan. What they consider a family, which is really mostly impossible now, is a wage-earning father and an at-home serving mother and dependent children. Well, that's impossible now. And they still have that ideology and make mothers feel very guilty for needing to work to support their families. But half of American women with children under 1 year old are in the labor force outside the home. That's even though daycare is exorbitant. They're outside the home, having their kids in inferior daycare. or cobbling together some arrangement with relatives who are often busy and then they have to miss work or leave the kid alone. At any rate, that's 50% of women with kids under 1, kids who can barely walk. And then 70% of women with kids under 6, even before school age. Their mothers are in the labor force. Children between 6 and 17 have mothers, 78% of which are in the labor force and out of the home. And it should be noted that most of the crimes committed by children and also against children happen between 3, when the schools are let out, and when their parents get home from work at about 6 o'clock in the evening. A majority of Americans live in cities. So they live in places where they can't just have their kids out on the street playing. It used to be that you could go out and play and somebody's mother would be home and take a look. Can't count on that now. And cities are more dangerous. The streets are unsafe. So children are home alone with a TV or video games or some other passive form of entertainment. They can't run around and get exercise, which their bodies really need. And they can't cook because that's too dangerous to use fire on the stove. So they're given great quantities of junk food. That's why 1 in 5 American kids is obese, not just fat or overweight, but obese, dangerously overweight, leading to all sorts of terrible things from premature development to diseases like diabetes. So their health is undermined. And this idea of the happy, rosy family, of the mother at home cooking and watching children, and the father being able to support everybody, that's gone, even though they still emphasize that that's really important, and that is what a Christian family is. Also, kids get out of school usually at around 3 o'clock. Wealthy public schools have lots of after-school activities. A lot of parents who have some money but don't want to spend the 42 grand, which is the average for a private school, will give to the PTAs in the better neighborhoods where they live. Some give as many as $10,000 a year. A PTA in a rich neighborhood can raise about $1 million just every year. The average is $851,000 for a wealthy school, whereas it's about 1/10 of that for a school in a poor neighborhood. I had a client who had 2 children. She didn't make much money, but she was a determined mother, and she spent an hour and a half on the subway each way to take her kids from her poor neighborhood in the Bronx down to an elegant neighborhood in Manhattan. Because in that neighborhood, they had an orchestra for the school where every kid could get an instrument to play and take it home. Wasn't theirs personally, but they could have it for the season of the orchestra. And where her kids belonged to the orchestra, they also belonged to the chess club, which played other chess clubs. They also, it's amazing, they also belonged to athletic teams that played other schools, and also to an arts club, and another one called Exploring Urban Explorers that took away a day, an afternoon really, a week to go to a different neighborhood on the subway and look at different neighborhoods. Children in public schools in poor areas don't have that. Of course, they need it the most. They're the ones who go home to an empty house and get fat on snacks while watching something passive. That's how capitalism works. To those that have, it is given. To those that don't have money, it isn't. Also, there's another bias that really hurts children in families. And by relegating children to be home with their families, you hurt them in this way. Hess and Shipman are two brilliant researchers who did research on how parents who are poor and parents who are wealthier, middle class, black parents, all of them, relate to their children and what are the differences and what are the results in cognitive abilities. And they found that poorer parents who are brought up having to follow orders teach their children to follow orders. And when they had a little etch, one of their experiments is giving parents and children an etch-a-sketch game where you move a knob and you get different designs. And the assignment was to recreate a design given by the experimenter. Well, when the child moved the design and knob in a way that didn't really work for the design given, the poorer parents would say no, whereas the wealthier ones tended to give an explanation. No, if you move it like this, it goes in that direction, and we want to go in this direction, so let's try moving it here. Another study they did was asking parents what would they say to children on their first day of school. And the wealthier parents would say, the teacher is there to help you. If you have a question, ask the teacher, because her job is to teach you. Whereas the poorer parents would say, you obey that teacher now. I don't want to hear you didn't follow orders. If she says something or he says something, you do it. Very different way of developing the right to question, the right to have explanations that make sense, and the way to puzzle out a situation, those cognitive skills that give you the necessity for understanding and a way to explain. So the authoritarian styles get communicated and children's intelligence gets truncated. And so the family is really not a good way to train people not to just obey orders, but to train them to think. That's why Althusser called the family the authoritarian family, really the authoritarian family, not all families. But the authoritarian family, an ideological state apparatus training people to submit and not give any trouble to the authority. Authoritarian religions are another reason that people cower and become passive rather than organize for the things they need in their lives. In authoritarian religions, they emphasize that you submit yourself to the rules of the Almighty, because it's always male pronoun, he is Almighty and you are not. And you must obey and submit to God and his emissary, of course, since God doesn't show, the priest, the imam, the rabbi. And that's true in authoritarian religions, which is not all religions. So, of course, there are exceptions. Dorothy Day taught Catholics to stand up for themselves, to question authority, and she was quite radical and amazing. Martin Luther King was a minister, not a Southern Baptist, because the Southern Baptists separated from the Northern Baptists over segregation. But they're the second biggest denomination in this country. However, Martin Luther King gave a different message, a message that we are all equal and we need to stand up together to make this world a kind place for everyone. Quite different. Also, there's the issue of corporal punishment, which teaches children you get hurt if you step out of line. Corporal punishment has been condemned by child development specialists across the board. But in evangelical religions that feel that children's questioning is a sign of the devil, corporal punishment is advised. In Dobson's book, he pushes spanking. Spanking is a way of getting kids to shut up and obey through force. And that's why spanking is actually a crime. Spanking your child is a crime in all of the European Union nations, in England, in Scandinavia, and in 20 other countries, not in the United States, which is quite sad for children. Corporal punishment is allowed at home completely and in private schools in all states except 5, where it's not allowed in private schools, just at home. So that's another thing that keeps people passive and feeling they better subordinate, because there is a retributive God who will get them if they don't. There's another contributor to American passivity, and this was developed by the Frankfurt School, a Marxian school that came from Germany. Their task was to try to understand, why did so many people go along with the Nazis? Even if they weren't all active in the party, why'd they go along? Why did they allow so many people to be murdered? Well, they explained that almost all German children were brought up in very authoritarian families. That was the style in Germany. And when they were in trouble, they had to really be worried that they better obey the authoritarian parent or they were going to get hurt. And so that in hard times where people feel unsafe, as they do now in the United States, since the empire is falling and American standards of living is falling too, at least for the majority, not for the top. But people get frightened. And when they're frightened, they want to say, okay, I'll obey. I'll do whatever you say, you who are in an authoritative position. And that's another contributor to passivity. That's what has made Trump kind of a totem, as I talked about, a kind of semi-religious figure who has to be obeyed. People wear at his rallies T-shirts that say, Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president, sort of savior's assistant there. And so all these things help understand why Americans were so passive in case they did elect Trump, or even if they didn't elect him, quite a few people voted for them. They voted for this seemingly irrational authority who wandered on and on, who wanted people to watch him sway to music for 40 minutes, who often didn't make sense, just as their parents didn't make sense. But they obeyed, or else they'd get hurt. So I do think that all those reasons combined to make Americans so passive that they would either elect, or if they didn't elect him, accept an authoritarian leader who wants revenge, retribution, who promises them nothing, who was already president and abandoned them in the time of the pandemic, who denied its existence, who sold our protective equipment, who scientists say is responsible for at least 450,000 deaths, and the fact that the United States lost the most lives in that pandemic. It doesn't really matter. You obey the authority. Now, what can we do about it? Besides questioning how 22 million votes were somehow lost and Trump didn't win by 22 million. I mean, what happened there? And standing up and questioning it aggressively, the way the Republicans did when they actually did lose, People just gave in for all these reasons of inculcated passivity. Well, how could we change it? What can we do about it? Our hope in the United States is to do what the French left did, to have the left unite, because then we're the majority. If we united the climate movement, the LGBTQIA, gay rights, and other groups' rights, and the Black Lives Matter movement, and the feminist movement, and the tenants' rights movements, and the disabled rights movement, disability rights, all the rights movements that want an egalitarian kind nation to unite under a united left, we would win. We'd be the majority. The peace movement, the Palestinian movement, there's lots of movements. If we came together, we would win. And what separated us, in part, is identity politics, which was introduced by the CIA and the FBI in an initiative called the Mighty Wurlitzer, where CIA agents like Gloria Steinem, very successful CIA agent, helped to make the women's movement women only and women against men. One of the slogans, "A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle," is typical. And infiltrated the civil rights movement to make civil rights movement into a black power movement against whitey. That way, creating an identity politics that severed the left. Well, we need to come together the way they did in France, because together we'll win and we'll have a kinder, better America. And without that, we're going to get a fascist America. Thank you. Goodbye for now.